The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial conflicts in United States history, marked by intense military violence, deep political divisions, and lasting global consequences. Among the many questions that arise when examining the war is why the United States, possessing overwhelming military superiority and the world's most powerful nuclear arsenal, did not drop a nuclear bomb on Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam. This question is especially striking, given that the United States had used atomic weapons less than 3 decades earlier in Japan. The absence of nuclear weapons in Vietnam was not accidental or inevitable. Rather, it was the result of strategic, political, moral, and international considerations that made nuclear use both unnecessary and dangerously counterproductive. Understanding why the United States did not drop a nuclear bomb on Hanoi helps illuminate broader lessons about nuclear restraint, Cold War politics, and the limits of military power. By the time the Vietnam War escalated in the early 1960s, nuclear weapons occupied a central place in U.S. military strategy. During the early Cold War, American defense planning relied heavily on nuclear deterrence to counter the perceived threat posed by the Soviet Union and later, the People's Republic of China. Nuclear weapons were designed primarily for large-scale war against other major powers, not for limited regional conflicts. Although U.S. leaders did consider the possibility of using nuclear weapons in Korea and elsewhere, such use was increasingly seen as a last resort rather than a routine battlefield option. Vietnam was fundamentally different from the scenarios nuclear weapons were designed to address. The conflict was a guerrilla war combined with a conventional struggle, fought largely in jungles, villages, and rural areas. Dropping a nuclear bomb on Hanoi would not have aligned with the strategic logic of counterinsurgency, which emphasized winning political support and undermining enemy legitimacy rather than simply destroying cities. From the outset, nuclear weapons were a poor fit for the nature of the war the United States was fighting. One of the most important reasons the United States did not use nuclear weapons against Hanoi was their limited military usefulness in achieving American objectives. Hanoi was an important political and administrative center, but destroying it would not have eliminated the North Vietnamese army or the guerrilla forces operating in South Vietnam. The decentralized nature of North Vietnam's military and political structure meant that leadership, supply lines, and troop deployments could adapt and survive even severe bombing. Moreover, the United States already possessed immense conventional firepower. Through campaigns such as Operation Rolling Thunder and later Linebacker 1 and 2, U.S. forces dropped millions of tons of conventional bombs on North Vietnam. These bombing campaigns caused significant damage, but failed to break North Vietnam's will to fight. If massive conventional bombing could not achieve decisive victory, it was unclear that nuclear weapons, despite their destructive power, would succeed where conventional weapons had failed. U.S. military planners understood that nuclear escalation would likely bring enormous costs without guaranteeing strategic success. Perhaps the most critical factor preventing nuclear use was the risk of escalation into a broader war involving other nuclear-armed states. North Vietnam was supported by both the Soviet Union and China, 2 major communist powers, with their own strategic interests in the conflict. Although neither Moscow nor Beijing wanted a direct war with the United States, the use of a nuclear weapon against Hanoi could have forced their hand. U.S. policymakers feared that a nuclear strike would provoke a military response from China, which had intervened in the Korean War a decade earlier, when it perceived a threat to its security. By the late 1960s, China had developed its own nuclear weapons, further complicating the strategic environment. Similarly, the Soviet Union, as North Vietnam's principal supplier of advanced weapons and air defense systems, could not ignore a nuclear attack on its ally without risking a loss of credibility. The possibility that a nuclear strike on Hanoi could escalate into a direct confrontation between nuclear powers made such an option extraordinarily dangerous. During the Cold War, avoiding nuclear war between superpowers was a paramount objective. U.S. leaders consistently judged that no potential gain in Vietnam justified the risk of triggering a global nuclear conflict. The political consequences of using nuclear weapons in Vietnam would have been severe, both internationally and domestically. By the 1960s, global attitudes toward nuclear weapons had shifted dramatically since 1945. The horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with growing awareness of radioactive fallout and long-term environmental damage, had made nuclear weapons symbols of mass destruction and moral catastrophe. A nuclear attack on Hanoi would have likely isolated the United States diplomatically. Many U.S. allies already viewed the Vietnam War with skepticism or outright opposition. Nuclear use would have intensified global condemnation, potentially fracturing alliances such as NATO and undermining America's claim to moral leadership. Non-aligned nations, whose support the United States sought in the broader Cold War competition, would almost certainly have turned against Washington. At home, nuclear escalation would have deepened political divisions. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had sparked widespread protests across the United States. Public trust in government was already eroding, and the use of nuclear weapons would have triggered massive domestic backlash. American leaders were keenly aware that political support for the war was fragile, and that nuclear escalation could provoke a crisis of legitimacy. Moral considerations also played a significant role in the decision not to use nuclear weapons. While war inevitably involves violence, nuclear weapons represented a qualitatively different level of destruction. A nuclear bomb dropped on Hanoi would have caused immense civilian casualties, as the city was home to hundreds of thousands of people. The resulting loss of life, suffering, and long-term health effects would have been impossible to justify as a proportionate military response. American leaders increasingly accepted the principle that nuclear weapons should be used only in the most extreme circumstances, such as national survival. Vietnam, though strategically important in the context of Cold War containment, was not viewed as an existential threat to the United States. The moral cost of nuclear use vastly outweighed any potential strategic benefit, reinforcing the case for restraint. By the time of the Vietnam War, an informal but powerful international norm against the use of nuclear weapons had begun to emerge, often described as the nuclear taboo. Although not codified in international law, this norm reflected a shared understanding that nuclear weapons were fundamentally different from conventional arms and should not be used except under the most extreme conditions. U.S. decision-makers were aware that breaking this taboo could have long-term consequences beyond Vietnam. If the United States normalized nuclear use in a regional conflict, other nuclear-armed states might feel justified in doing the same. This could have undermined global efforts at arms control and increased the likelihood of nuclear war elsewhere. Preserving the nuclear taboo was therefore seen as a strategic interest in its own right. It is important to note that nuclear options were not entirely absent from internal U.S. discussions. At various points, particularly during moments of frustration or escalation, some military planners and political figures raised the possibility of nuclear use. However, these ideas never advanced beyond theoretical consideration. Each time the issue arose, the overwhelming risks and limited benefits led civilian leadership to reject nuclear escalation. Presidents from John F. Kennedy to Richard Nixon ultimately concluded that nuclear weapons would not solve the fundamental problems of the Vietnam War. The conflict was rooted in political legitimacy, nationalism, and ideology, issues that could not be resolved through sheer destructive force, no matter how powerful.